So, we ended last week with the official recognition of women's ordination to the priesthood, and that was joined by the first reading in 1976 of the 79 prayer book. So the 60s and 70s in the Episcopal Church was just one, in one sense, one upheaval after another. Prayer book revision, come on in.
She won't let me sit down, but I'll stand.
Prayer book revision, women's ordination, Vietnam War, changing reality of blacks in the Episcopal Church. All of this led to all kinds of incredible upheaval in the church. This was all joined in the 70s by yet another upheaval in the church, and that upheaval was the charismatic renewal. It began actually in the 60s, and it was once again looking at our theological understanding of who we were as Christians. It began in various mainline denominations. In the Episcopal Church, it pretty much had its roots in, of all places, Van Nuys, California. Now, Van Nuys, California, if you know anything about California, is in the San Fernando Valley. It's a suburb of LA, and that is where, in the Episcopal Church, charismatic renewal began. It took on in Seattle when a man named Dennis Bennett went there as the rector of an Episcopal church, and then began to make its way east across the country. By the end of the 70s, when we now had women's ordination was legal, and the first reading of the new prayer book had passed, which pretty much ensured that the second reading would pass in 1979. By that point in time, these kinds of changes caused some people in the Episcopal Church to decide that maybe the church had gone too far. In particular, there were a group of bishops who formed something called the Evangelical and Catholic Mission. They were bishops from what is called the Beretta Belt. The Beretta Belt got its name back in the late 1800s when Anglo-Catholics moved west from the East Coast and settled in and around the Great Lakes. So Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin in particular were considered the Beretta Belt. They were considered to be a part of the church that was heavily Anglo-Catholic. Needless to say, they were not crazy about the new prayer book, and they weren't. They were even less crazy about the ordination of women. They had their own church meeting after 1976, and they created a new body, which was led by the then Bishop of Peoria, and they called themselves the Anglican Church in North America. However, what they learned very quickly is the Archbishop of Canterbury only recognizes one branch of the Anglican Church in the United States. So there was a belief that by creating the Anglican Church in North America that they would be able to be part of the Anglican Communion worldwide, and that didn't happen. So they were not invited to the Lambeth Conference of 1978 and remained outside of course, the mainstream of the Episcopal Church. It also was very difficult for the members of this new body, the Anglican Church in North America, to decide on their essentials. They had some people who believed that fundamental to who they should be was Anglo-Catholic worship. They had others who believed that fundamental to who they should be is the lordship of Jesus Christ. There was debate as to whether they should use the 1928 prayer book or a supplement that only existed in Anglo-Catholic circles called the Anglican Missal. So they couldn't agree on who they were going to be, which did not help them at all. In the midst of this, some people who did not favor the ordination of women felt that joining congregations that were embracing charismatic renewal was the way to go, because many of those clergy were against the ordination of women, but not all of them. In addition to that, there was the whole issue of the fact that the 1979 prayer book would have Rite 1 and Rite 2. Rite 1 is virtually the 1928 prayer book with some important liturgical changes being made in it. Rite 2 is simply the rite in contemporary language. Now, I will tell you, 40 years on, that it's really funny. When you look at our Rite 2 in our prayer book, and if you were to put it side by side with Common Worship from the Church of England, Common Worship was published in 2000, and there's a big difference in those 30 years in what people considered contemporary English. And I don't just mean the difference between England and the United States. England went even further than we even considered going in using contemporary language. It's not to say that the word ain't is in there and stuff like that. It's just the syntax, the way words flow at times makes infinitely more sense in Common Worship 30 years later than in the 1979 prayer book. But remember, I said a couple of weeks ago that all of our work on the 79 prayer book actually began back in the late 50s and the early 60s. So it was sort of dragging this anchor from post-World War II as they were moving.
More like 50 years removed from.
In many ways, it is, you're absolutely correct. In many ways, the bulk of the work was in the 60s, and it was finalized in the 70s. But yes, you're right. The bulk of the work would have been 50 years ago. Yeah. Exactly. So, we have this charismatic renewal that adds to the flavor of the Episcopal Church. That raised all kinds of questions about things like speaking in tongues, laying on of hands. You see, the traditional understanding of the laying on of hands is that's what the bishop does when he ordains you or confirms you. And in those days, it would have been the word he, okay? Well, within the charismatic renewal, the laying on of hands was part of the prayer ministry. And that was something that lay people offered to each other, as we do here, okay? And so lay people praying involved laying on of hands. Well, you can just imagine, for some people, you know, what are they trying to do? Play priest? No. It's simply imparting the gifts of the Spirit. The charismatic renewal caught on in the 70s because what people in various places began to see was that such revitalized worship reinvigorated congregations. So where it began in Van Nuys, St. Mark's Van Nuys was a sleepy parish that woke up and gave birth to all these other parishes up and down the West Coast, which then gave birth to parishes across the country. This was the time, you've heard Ben talk about having grown up in the charismatic renewal. Well, this was the time in the late 60s and early 70s when his parish embraced charismatic renewal. It was in this whole wave, okay? Not that his parish needed to be revitalized, but dying parishes in Houston were revitalized by the charismatic renewal. A church in Akron, Ohio, which was dying, was revitalized by this. A man named Terry Fulham took a small parish in Darien, Connecticut, Darien had two parishes. It had Christ Church Darien, which was the big one. And then it had the other one. Do you remember the name of the other parish?
St. Paul's.
St. Paul. I think it is St. Paul's Darien. I think you're right. Well, anyway, yeah, it is. I just found it in my notes. Terry Fulham went to this small parish at the request of the bishop, brought in the charismatic renewal, and it went from small to vying with Christ Church Darien in terms of size. And by size, I mean the number of people in the parish attending regularly.
And that's basically brought renewals in New England.
That's very good. That was the start of the charismatic renewal in New England, okay? There was a church in Malden, the name of which has gone right out of my mind.
I live in Malden, I know St. Peter's is small. Oh, goodness.
I can't remember the name of it. When I was in seminary, which was in the 80s,
Is it St. Mary's?
I don't know. I have no memory whatsoever, but
I'll remember it, sir.
when I was in seminary in the 80s, it was the big charismatic renewal parish in the Diocese of Massachusetts, okay? So, this charismatic renewal that was happening in the Episcopal Church in the 70s and 80s was not an isolated thing. You'll remember over the winter and spring, we've had revivals and renewal and revivals and renewal within the history of not only the Episcopal Church, but the country. And part of that was happening in other denominations back in the 70s. So in the Roman Catholic Church, Curcio, which also came into the Episcopal Church, became an arm of renewal. Lutherans and Methodists had their own, I think the Methodists call it Road to Emmaus, but they had their own version of renewal movement going on. The problem was much of the roots were within the Pentecostal world. And if you could dress it up and make it look nice and not use the word Pentecostal, people could be open to it. But if they found out about speaking in tongues and roots in the Pentecostal world, Episcopalians got very nervous and did what we always do when we get nervous about how you worship. We just make disparaging remarks. Sort of like yesterday. Apparently, there were a whole bunch of disparaging remarks about the service because the music was blended, because the preacher was not your classic English bishop preaching, you know, all kinds of things, which Anglicans tend to do when something isn't the way we think it's supposed to be, the way it always was.
The last 7 words of the church,
Yeah.
we've never done it that way.
Yeah, you all know the last 7 words of the church, we've never done it that way before, okay? Which is meant to say, stop, okay? Anyway, all of a sudden, parishes in Houston, in Akron, Ohio, in Darien, Connecticut, and various other places are coming on fire. And they're coming on fire with things that don't look totally Anglican. Footnote, in the midst of all this in the 70s, we are moving towards a new hymnal. And part of the debate, although there were many debates about that, part of the debate was, what would the new music look like? Now bear in mind, in the 70s, when all this is going on, Rome has been ordered into the Vatican II revisions. So Rome's Mass is now in English. The music is all with guitars. The organs in the Roman churches are up in a gallery and are collecting dust. And I knew several of the people who were on the hymnal revision committee, one of whom was the organist in my home parish. And a lot of their discussion was not to go down the same road as Rome, which at that point in time had sort of abandoned their organs for guitar music. I mean, imagine, said with respect, and you know that I play the organ, these organists just could see their whole future being wiped out while we're strumming around here looking really good, okay? Which was never going to happen. So the revision of the hymnal is very sparse on the kind of music that was out there in the Episcopal Church in the 70s. What they did instead was they tried to diversify the hymnal by including music from across the globe, most of which was never really taught to people in the pew. So there's a Chinese hymn in there, and I don't remember what it is, where it is, but there's one in there that comes from, I think it's the church in Taiwan, I'm not sure. There's a Christmas carol in there. The tune is an old carol. The words come from a Huron carol. And then we've got Ghanaian music, but we didn't take the best of the Ghanaian music. And we've got all sorts of things. And one or two pieces of music that were emerging in the charismatic renewal. The problem with all of this is that when you aren't committed to contemporary music in the hymnal, you start making choices that, okay, well, throw that one in, that'll make them all happy. Throw that one in, that'll make them all happy. And you're not really thinking about what are they saying theologically? What is it conveying musically? Then every now and then, you pick one and you swear that it's musically the worst possible thing. But we've got to have something contemporary. And so you put the hymn in there, and then 45 years later, there are a ton of Episcopalians who believe that if it is Easter and you don't sing "I am the bread of life," something is wrong with the world. "I am the bread of life" came right out of charismatic renewal. The Roman Catholic side of it, because it was written by a nun, but people will say it is the worst possible hymn, and yet, if you listen to Episcopalians sing it on Easter, they sound like they believe every word that is in there. Most of those guys who did the 1982 hymnal are dead. If they were alive today, they would be blown away by the popularity of something like "I am the bread of life." So anyway.
Is that because everybody knows it?
Well, part of it is everybody knows it, and second of all, I would argue that from an organist point of view, if you've got to embrace something new that was in the 1982 hymnal, that was the one to embrace, because on an organ, it sounds so much better on an organ than it does with a guitar. I mean, just if you can imagine that musically, it just sounds so much better with an organ. And so if you're going to embrace something, you want to embrace something that sounds good, okay? Yesu, Yesu, which is Ghanaian, does not sound good on an organ. It doesn't sound good on a piano. It does not sound good with a guitar. It probably sounds very good in a village in Ghana.
Now, is that one that's supposed to be mostly verbal with little musical instruments, or do we just have the wrong type of instruments?
Right, we try to do it with all the wrong types of instruments. You're asking that question caused my mind to say, it might sound really good if we took all of our congas, djembes,
The drums.
and bongos and got a beat going and then sang it over an ongoing beat. But what happens in most parishes is they put little flutes and strings on the organ, and then what you get is, "Yesu, Yesu, fill us with your love."
And it's probably supposed to be, Yesu!
It's probably, well, not just loud, it's just probably something that could be sung that way. But imagine singing that with drumming going on underneath it. Somebody's got a rhythm going, okay?
African rap, it needs a
Well, yeah. Okay, there we go. Well said. All right, so we have all these changes going on. We have people who want to form another church. And in the midst of, I forgot to tell you, one of the big changes in the 70s, 1973, the Episcopal Church voted to allow the remarriage of divorced people. Up until 1973, if you were divorced, you could not be remarried in the Episcopal Church unless you could show that you were the wronged party. So if your spouse had an affair and you divorced the spouse, you could petition to be remarried, but it was still going to be up to the bishop. Now it was rewritten that divorced people could be remarried in the church. It would require the permission of the bishop, and it would require meeting with a priest in your parish who would then petition the bishop for permission for the priest to perform the service. So it wasn't like the bishop was saying, I give you permission, I give the priest permission to preside.
You had to write a letter to the bishop telling why you wanted to get married and why you got a divorce.
Right. All of that had to be explained in detail. And the new canon said that you could be remarried, but you also had to explain what was, this isn't the word, the disposition of any children of the marriage. In other words, if you had walked out on your spouse and had abandoned your children, that had to be said to the bishop, because that would say something about whether or not the priest would get permission to remarry you. If there was a joint agreement kind of thing, that was all fine. But if you had abandoned your children and now just wanted to come around and get married again,
right,
that wasn't going to work. 1977. By the fall of 77, women's ordination is in full swing within the Episcopal Church. And there are bishops who did not agree to the ordination of women. Let's back up. Obviously, bishops are the ones who ordain. So in order to figure out how the House of Bishops was going to work with this, they held a special meeting in Port St. Lucie, Florida. The bishops arrived, and the whole point of the meeting was to discuss how to accommodate bishops who refused to ordain women. Even though the church had said women were free to be ordained, there were dioceses where that was not happening. And at that time, fall of 77, there were a lot of dioceses. I can't tell you for sure how many dioceses we had back in those days. We've got about 109 now. I would argue that we probably had 90 some odd. I would argue that we've created about 10 dioceses in the last 40 years, so we probably were around 95, 96, something like that. And of that, I would suggest to you that there were probably 25 or so bishops who would not ordain women. If the bishop's not going to ordain women, then the diocese, if the diocesan isn't, then the diocese isn't going to be putting women candidates forward, okay? So, the bishops met at Port St. Lucie, Florida. The presiding bishop at the time was a man named John Maury Allen. He was from Mississippi. He had reservations about the ordination of women. What'd you say?
He offered to resign.
He did offer to resign. But in their meeting, the House of Bishops came up with a conscience clause to appease the opponents of women's ordination. And that clause said that no bishop priest, or layperson should be coerced or penalized in any manner, nor suffer any canonical disabilities as a result of his or her conscientious objection to or support of the actions of the 65th General Convention regarding the ordination of women. You see, when we say things canonically, we don't say them simply. In essence, all it was saying was, you cannot penalize someone for their conscientious objection or their support of the ordination of women. I use the word canonical, and that's not fair. This was adopted by the House of Bishops, so it had no effect on the canon that now, in one sense, that on the canon that now allowed the ordination of women. But bishops do preside at ecclesiastical trials, as we mentioned last week when we were talking about Bishop Jim Pike. And what the House of Bishops was trying to do in 77 was come to a place where we would not have a bishop in favor of the ordination of women bringing charges against somebody who wasn't in favor, nor did we want to have the reverse happen. So we're trying, once again, to walk the via media. It was also a conscience clause to protect clergy, rectors in particular, that a rector who wished to present a woman for ordination, but the diocesan doesn't believe in the ordination of women, if that priest had a way to present that woman in another diocese, that the diocesan from the home diocese would not be free to pursue ecclesiastical charges against that priest or that layperson who wants to become a priest. Okay, so we've assured that there would be no punishment for those who opposed, in particular, the ordination of women. But while they were at this meeting, the bishops also used this as a time to address issues of personal morality. Okay, so we rewrote the canons, as I mentioned, on remarriage. At Port St. Lucie, the bishops went on to say that it is clear from Scripture that heterosexual marriage was affirmed and homosexual activity condemned. Therefore, it is the mind of the HOB that no bishop of the church shall confer holy orders in violation of these principles.
Is that because Paul Moore already had?
That is exactly why. My bishop in New York, Paul Moore, earlier in 1977, ordained a woman whose name is, I think she's dead, was Ellen Barrett, who was not only a lesbian, but she was the president of an organization that had been created in the Episcopal Church in the early 70s called Integrity. And Integrity was merely an organization for gays and lesbians who were feeling oppressed and wanted to have a way to come together. And, in the same way that there's the, Union of Black Episcopalians, and there's a Hispanic group today, I don't remember the name of it. Anyway, the point was that Paul Moore had ordained a lesbian. Don't even go down the path that your mind might want to go down. She was the first gay person, homosexual person that was ever ordained? No. She was the first one who had put it right out there as to what her sexuality was. The church, meaning General Convention, then took it a step further in 1979 and reaffirmed, quote, the traditional teaching of the church on marriage, marriage fidelity, and sexual chastity as the standard of Christian sexual morality. And for the ordained, they are expected to conform to this standard. Therefore, we believe it is not appropriate for this church to ordain a practicing homosexual or any person who is engaged in heterosexual relationships outside of marriage. So we've gone from the 60s and 70s into the early 80s. It's sort of like moving from one social issue to another with a little liturgical stuff thrown in underneath it all. And we get to the 80s and we begin to look around in the early 80s and realize this church is not where it was 20 years before. Not everybody is satisfied with where the church is, but some things have been broken open, like women's ordination. Some things have been moved from back here to the forefront, like issues of ordaining openly practicing homosexuals. Some issues have moved forward, like praying in tongues, raising hands, things like this. The other fascinating thing that people began to realize by the 80s is because of the prayer book revision that began in the mid-60s, and in some parishes that involved using these books that were published for trial use. And the Zebra book, the Green book, it was the church's attempt to create contemporary language for the Eucharist. So, by the early 80s, in some settings, but certainly not all, you had people who had no memory of the 1928 prayer book. If your parish had been willing to engage in liturgical reform, you probably hadn't used the 1928 prayer book since sometime in the 60s. Well, by the early 80s, if you were born in the 60s and you went through all these drafts and trial books and all like that, you had no understanding. You had no more understanding, even though you may have been a cradle Episcopalian, you had no more understanding than some of you today who have come to Christ Church in the last, let's say, 10 years, where it's just been the 79 prayer book, okay? This was a time when you had parishes. In the New York Times back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, on Saturday, they would, and most city newspapers did this, they would list the times for the services for anybody who wanted to buy an ad. And you would see the ads for the Episcopal churches, those who were buying them in the New York Times, on Saturday morning, 8 o'clock, 1928. 11 o'clock, right one. And then you'd go to the next church. 8 o'clock, right one. 11 o'clock, right two. And then you go to the next church. 8 o'clock, right two. 11 o'clock, right two. And then you go to the next church. Morning prayer. I mean, it was all over. I'm just talking about New York, obviously. But it wasn't different than any other metropolis in the sense that right two is what we do on Sunday morning. That's the contemporary language in the 1979 prayer book. Right one is what we do at 8 o'clock, and that is the traditional Elizabethan language. And that is what was in 1928, 1892, 1789.
Except B isn't as old as, right? We use B.
Oh, yes, the second Eucharistic prayer at 8 o'clock was an attempt to take the traditional language of the Rite One Eucharistic prayer, which is long, and shorten it, and try to keep it theologically sound. So yes, there are two possibilities, but they're both in Elizabethan English. Just so you all know, if you watched the wedding yesterday, that was common worship, and our service last week was common worship. That is the first time that I have seen a royal service done with the contemporary language. When Will and Kate were married, it was 1662. When their father and Diana were married, it was 1662. 1662, as you may recall, back in the winter, I said, the official prayer book of the Church of England is 1662, because Parliament has not voted to update the prayer book. Church has from time to time, but they have not been able to get Parliament to do it.
Parliament is embedded enough in the church to even be
The church,
concerned with
it's a state church,
But,
which means, and that's been the case. I mean, you go back to Elizabeth the First.
well, right, but even though it's a state church, are the people in Parliament actually members of an Episcopal church?
It doesn't matter.
Or whatever? So if they don't
Most,
care,
I would argue most of them are not.
so then they don't give a crap about the Episcopal.
But by British constitutional law, they have a say.
And ecclesiastical law is considered civil law as well.
Yes, yes. Church law is civil law. So, they are like this. And because they are like this, go way back to January when we were talking about the colonial church. As we came out of the Revolution, the last thing Anglicans in this country wanted was to see this sort of stuff continue with the government. And so, and remember when Seabury went over to try to be consecrated as a bishop,
Yep, yeah, go to Scotland.
he had to go to Scotland because he would not swear allegiance to the crown, which every bishop does in England. So therefore, he had to find somebody who was not going to require that.
Yeah.
Okay? Anyway, all these changes mean that the Episcopal Church went like this and this and this and this in terms of who's in, who's out, who's happy, who's not happy. The period of time in the 70s and 80s was pretty much nothing but that. I think it was in General Convention 1988. Let me back up and say, up until then, the way you determined how many people were in your parish was you counted baptized people. Well, somebody was baptized here in 1945. They've never transferred their membership. We don't know where they live, but under the old rules, that was a baptized member of the parish. And so when you counted, that's how you got a head count. The Diocese of New York got really smart early on, back, I want to say it was the early 20th century. They had a head tax. In other words, your assessment was based on your parochial report and the number of members of the parish. So you could say that you had 5,000 members of your parish, but you're going to pay a head tax. And
So you wanted to pay a tax on the heads that showed up.
who did you want to pay a head tax on? Right? Now, in the Diocese of New York back in the day, you paid a head tax, and the number of delegates that you got to convention was based on the size of the parish. So there, you had these two opposing forces where, keep the numbers up because we get more delegates to convention, but we got to pay, and I'm not talking, $100 a head. I don't remember what the head tax was, but it was part of your assessment, okay? Yeah,
USA, it's $40 a head.
I forgot they do that.
They cleared the rolls and
Well,
like 400,000 plus people in this.
and what was happening in the 80s was the church began to look at the reality of how many people do we really have?
You
And
might have thought they were thriving when really they were diving.
well said. So in 88, we changed the way we count our attendance, our membership. And it's based on what has come to be known in the last 30 years as the ASA, Average Sunday Attendance. Now, average Sunday attendance at one level isn't concerned with whether you're confirmed here or not. It's not even concerned with whether you're baptized. You can be trying to decide if you want to become a Christian. And you can be here Sunday after Sunday. You count as the ASA. When we do what's called the parochial report is when we have to then start picking through that to figure out who's confirmed, who's a communicant, which means confirmed and contributing. Okay?
And receiving.
And receiving, right, right. So ASA has become the more important number. Who's in the pew on Sunday morning? So all of a sudden, you had churches that said, oh, we've got 5,000 members, but their ASA was 100. Well, thriving diving, okay? What's the true story about that parish? It's the 100 faithful people that are there Sunday after Sunday. It's not all the others. Now, that doesn't mean that we've thrown all the others out with the bathwater. It just means that we're trying to have a more realistic vision of who the Episcopal Church is.
Some of those people who aren't coming might be donating members, but unable to show up because they're in nursing homes.
Well, and you see, when you do the parochial report, which is a report that every parish has to send to the national church so that they have a picture of the health of the church. One of the things that you do indicate in the parochial report is not only the ASA, but you do indicate communions taken away from the church. So in other words, when Dixie or Kay go to visit some of our at-home members, those communions count as much as Sunday morning, okay? They're recorded in a book, and we indicate how many of those communions there are, and there's separate columns so that we indicate that these were at home and these communions were here.
At church, okay.
And these were the communions here on Sunday, and then these were the communions here on weekdays, and then these were the communions at home, hospital, nursing home, etc.
And that was a problem with kids too, right? When we first started giving little kids communion.
Oh,
Places were counting communions and not communions.
right. And there was a time, this is total trivia, and I'm going to have to go in a minute, but there was a time when some parishes would count attendance by how many wafers were used. So in other words, if the altar guild put out 100 wafers, and if at the end of the service there were 14 wafers left, then that meant there were 86 people in church.
How many fell on the floor?
Well, several things. First of all, if a child was too young to actually receive a wafer, not because they weren't baptized or anything, but they were just, Kimberly can't eat a wafer, okay? But she'll count for being in church, okay? So when you only counted wafers, you were only counting the people who actually got their butt up out of the pew and walked up to receive communion. You know how it is. People who don't walk up, then in those situations didn't get counted. So that's why we realized we got to do something that kind of keeps all of our parishes, whether your ASA is 40 or 400, we got to do something that keeps all of us talking the same numbers.
Yeah.
Once we did that, we also began to realize that the Episcopal Church was not as big as we wanted to believe it was. So those days back in the 50s when they said we were 5 million people, and then, okay, so maybe we're 3.5 million people in the early 70s, and then maybe we're 2.5 million, okay? And that's only because nobody had a consistent way of counting. Now, it may look silly, but that's why the ushers walk along and count. And then they don't tell me what the count is, so when I'm setting the table, I've already done my head count, so I have some idea of how many wafers to put out. Not because I'm counting the wafers, but what happens when we don't do that is we end up with reserved sacrament that's this much, and if you don't know how many are there, you start consecrating another 100 wafers, and you've already got 150 in reserved sacrament. We don't need it. That's more trivia than you need. Anyway, the last thing I'm going to say is we're at a point and at a time where we're talking about revising all this stuff again.
Now?
Yes, There is talk about a new prayer book. There has been for several years. There's talk about a new hymnal, has been for several years. And many people are urging constraint along this line.
We lose like 100,000 people over time.
Our numbers,
We ain't got to lose.
But-
I'm in my 70s, I won't see it in my lifetime.
well, in all likelihood, no. And the big issue with any kind of further revision is this. In this age in which churches want to be user-friendly, in which music is changing on a regular basis, how do you encapsulate that in a hardbound book, be it a prayer book or be it a hymnal?
It'd be as big as Oxford English Dictionary.
And it would be out of date, and in the case of a hymnal, it'd be out of date tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's like common worship's like 7 volumes.
A common worship right now, there is a main volume, and then there are at least 7 supplements, and those supplements go from season to season.
Wow.
And each one of those supplements offers multiple. That's where we get our prayers of the people, is from common worship, from the supplements. And because we do a bulletin the way we do, it's easy for us to incorporate that sort of stuff. So I ask you to pray for the Episcopal Church that we don't do something crazy like try to revise the prayer book and the hymnal. You want to see war?
You know, Carl Russell left here to go to St. Paul's Terrier. He took over for Terry Fuller.
Oh, he did?
Yes.
I didn't know that.
And the second thing is we have 2 associates, what do you call them?
Yeah, associate rectors.
Who were married with children and left here and went somewhere else and then came out. Divorced their wives and came out. One of whom was down with Paul Moore, where someone from this parish went on to become a priest and was his sex and deployment canon.
Really?
Yes.
Oh my God.
Her ministry was